Autistic Tony Stark by ajexists. Work 9. Growing Beyond the Seed. Good afternoon, Mr. Stark. Afternoon, Miss Owens. Soon after getting diagnosed, yet after the whole leaking incident had settled, Tony sought after a therapist. Well, more accurately, the psychologist had called Tony once more recommending one, and Pepper urged him. It still took another month of convincing. He never liked the idea of talking to a stranger about his problems, and having his diagnosis leaked to the world didn't help things, but he eventually realised it was for the best. Even if he still ignored the autism, there was still a shit ton of trauma he's experienced throughout his entire life that certainly doesn't make his life easy. Plus, Peter wrote a whole PowerPoint on how therapy has helped him, with videos from Pepper, Rhodey, and even Damn Happy all telling him in their special, unique ways that he really needed to see a therapist. Please, Tony, go see a therapist. Come on, man, you've needed one for years. Just listen to the kid and do it already. Get help. So, he finally listened. He eventually found Dr. Though she told him she just prefers Ms. Nicole Owens, originally getting her PhD in psychology so she could diagnose children and adults with autism. She then realised just how much she wanted to help them, especially the adults, and not just slap a diagnosis and send them away. So she opened up her own practice to do just that, helping late realised autistic individuals navigate the world with this new discovery. She also went back to school to take classes on trauma and how that could affect autistic individuals. Needless to say, Tony was impressed, so he started seeing her. How's your work been? Tony sighed. He leaned back on the plush couch, reaching over to the end table, which had a bucket full of fidgets and sensory-related items. He grabbed the textured monkey noodle, the ends of it having heads and tail of a dinosaur. He ran it through his hands, then rolled it up and squeezed it. Tony really liked this fidget during therapy. It was nice to stim with on its own, but Tony noticed how he'd often get antsy during the heavier talks, so his stimming with said fidget would get more aggressive, so to speak. It's often how Ms. Owens was able to tell a topic was getting serious. He would start off stimming like he was currently, running it through his hands with an occasional squeeze, but the more uncomfortable a topic got, he would start picking at the little rubber spikes, or twisting it around his hand so tightly to the point where Ms. Owens didn't know if she should be concerned about the toy breaking, or Tony cutting off circulation, which only made her more concerned when after a few seconds of the simple stimming, he started picking at the rubber spikes. Tony sat in silence a little longer, now twisting the toy around his thumb. He sighed once more. Not great. Ms. Owens tilted her head with a frown, staying quiet for a few seconds. She always allows her clients time to process questions or build up the courage to answer one, giving them a push when needed. Tony didn't need a push that time, however, eventually following up with, I had meltdowns this week, multiple ones. I'm so sorry, Tony, that's horrible, Ms. Owens empathised. Do you think you can explain the causes of those meltdowns? Tony set the fidget down on his lap and rubbed his hands across his face. It was just an insanely busy and tough week. I had 5 meetings at work this week, with 3 of them being incredibly frustrating and annoying. The other 2 were boring as shit and should have been an email. He rolled his eyes and picked back up the fidget, twisting it across his fingers and palms. The Accords meeting ended up being moved when Peter and I normally have lab time because of some thing Ross had to attend to. He mimicked quotation marks when he said the word thing, rolling his eyes as well. Then the day we moved lab day to, Peter woke up throwing up, so we had to cancel again. He squeezed his eyes shut. And at the end of it all, Pepper and I got into an argument. Ms. Owens frowned. About? Misunderstandings, basically, he replied, opening his eyes. He shrugged and picked the rubber spikes. She came down to the lab to talk to me about something. I don't even remember what, and I was just sitting there. Can't remember if I was on my phone or just staring off into space, but I wasn't doing any work. She got mad because of that, saying I can't just continue to slack off. I kept saying I was trying, even though I wasn't doing anything, yada yada yada. Long story short, the argument ended up with me having a meltdown. Tony glanced up to see a worried expression on the therapist's face. Don't worry, Doc, it got resolved. He looked back down at the fidget. After the meltdown, we sat together in silence for a while, and she explained her side, that she was already mad and stressed because of her own bullshit meetings and dealing with assholes who kept pushing certain projects back. Then coming down to see me doing nothing was just the final nail in the coffin, or whatever phrase she said. He sighed, rubbing his eyes as he felt the exhaustion coming back. I told her about my week, about how this was my third or fourth meltdown, and she forced me to take a couple of days off. I'm glad to hear you got the argument sorted out, Ms. Owens smiled, then asked, How many days off did you take? Only 2, Tony replied, because there is a prototype for a product that needs to be done by the end of the week, which thankfully I'm on the final touches of now. That's good to hear, Ms. Owens smiled again. Were the 2 days off helpful at all? Do you feel like you've gotten some energy back? Tony stayed quiet for a while, so she added on, It's okay if you felt like it wasn't helpful, or you don't know if it was or not. No, it did help, Tony quickly answered. I felt kind of bad at first, but I needed it, so... He shrugged. Ms. Owens tilted her head. Felt kind of bad how? He sighed. Well, I mean, I knew I was supposed to be working, so the fact I wasn't threw me off a little. He bit his cheek. Then, internalized ableism came in. He heard Ms. Owens hum, and he looked up to see her nodding her head. He smirked. Expected to hear that? She smirked as well and shrugged. Maybe. Been doing this a long time. Tony chuckled. He moved himself on the couch so he was laying across it, facing the wall. There were the typical thoughts. Get over yourself, you should be working. You're overreacting, normal people don't do this. Same old, same old. He sighed, then let out a small smile. I did recognise these thoughts, though, was able to stop them. You did? When Tony nodded to confirm, Ms. Owens smiled brightly. That's awesome, I'm incredibly proud of you. And she was, even if Tony looked away, his face showing that he believed otherwise. Tony cleared his throat, then told her, I had other thoughts as well. She quizzically looked at him. What kinds of thoughts? A hint of concern was present in her voice. Tony, then realising how bad his words sounded, clarified. They weren't bad. Well, I don't know if they are necessarily positive, just... They aren't what you're thinking of, Tony sighed, rubbing his face and mumbled. Ugh, I'm making things sound worse. It's all right, Tony, she said. Tell me the thoughts you did have. He took a deep breath. He moved the fidget across his palm so he could feel the soft rubber texture. Tony took some time thinking about how he would word the thoughts he had. Then eventually he told her. I kept thinking about when I was younger. I knew something was wrong, different about me for a long time. He paused. There's a part of me that just wishes I knew. He swallowed the lump in his throat. There were so many things I struggled with as a kid, and I felt like if I knew, if I was diagnosed as a child, so many things in my life would have been easier. Tony squeezed his eyes shut, the grip on the toy tightening. I also know my father was a piece of shit, and if he had a word to describe my weirdness... He huffed out a laugh, dark and cold. Well, there's a good chance I'd be in some nut house somewhere on the brink of death. He knew the words he was saying were harsh and probably incorrect in some ways, but in that moment he didn't care. He felt angry. Tony opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. It's unfair. It's unfair that no matter what I could have been diagnosed, I still would have had a shitty life, which makes me wish I was never autistic at all. Tears started leaking out of his eyes. That would have made everything better. No fucked up child, no father who wishes the worst out of you, no struggles, nothing would be wrong or unbelievably fucked up. Tony's voice cracked and the tears fell. He quickly wiped his cheek, putting his heels of his palms against his eyes to try to stop them. He felt the energy inside him boil up and he growled. Tony sat back up and rocked, wrapping his arms around his legs and putting his head on his knees. His eyes being free allowed him to silently cry. Ms. Owens watched silently as she got up to grab a couple of things, a pillow, a tablet and a bottle of water. She walked over and sat beside the couch, quietly counting through the 4-square breathing technique. After a few minutes, Tony raised his head up, wiping his face. Ms. Owens handed over the 3 items to him. First, the water, which he took a sip of and handed it back. The second was the pillow, which Tony punched a couple of times to take out some more energy. He then released a deep breath and placed the pillow against his chest. Last off was the tablet, which Tony took with a confused look on his face. He turned it on, and what popped up was an app that had a bunch of words on the bottom, a place to type out a sentence on top, and on the side a speaker button. He looked up at her confused, and she told him, "In case you're unable to speak, you can type out a sentence and it'll say it out loud to me." Tony nodded and looked back at the screen. He tapped on the top line and a keyboard came up, typing out a sentence, then pressing the speaker button. The tablet voiced out, "I'm sorry." "It's okay, Tony, there's nothing to apologise for. Not for breaking down, not for anything you said. There are no apologies needed." Ms. Owens softly smiled at him. "Now I do have some thoughts on the matter. If you want to and are ready to hear them, you can let me know by typing out or saying, 'ready.' If that's not okay too. We still have time left in this session, so if you need that time to recover, that's perfectly fine by me. Just let me know." Tony nodded, setting the tablet down and wrapping his arms around the pillow. He saw Ms. Owens stand up and walk back over to her desk, hearing occasional ruffles of papers. After a few minutes, he picked the tablet back up, typing out and having it speak. "Ready." Ms. Owens looked over at Tony and nodded. While she moved back over to her chair, Tony repositioned himself again to be sitting up, body facing towards her, yet still hugging the pillow close to his chest. She sat down and spoke softly. "I want to start out by saying all of the thoughts and feelings you just expressed are normal. I cannot tell you how many clients I have that have expressed a wish of getting diagnosed as a child. After discovering something that can perfectly explain everything you do and have done, it's completely understandable why they wish they could have known about it their whole life. I also cannot tell you how many of them felt angered by the fact it still might not have made things easier because of their home life." She sighed. "I understand why you may wish to never be autistic. The world was not built for autistic people to thrive, and too many people lack basic respect for all human beings. Just remember, though, that it is never your fault for what your father did to you. You were a child, and even if you were being disrespectful in his eyes, all arguments against you got thrown away the moment he put his hands on you and attacked. No child, no matter how rude or disrespectful they may appear to be, ever deserves to be abused." Tony swallowed the lump in his throat and gave a small nod. Ms. Owens softly smiled. She continued by saying, "We don't know what your childhood would have been like if you were diagnosed young. Sure, there is a strong chance your father would have reacted poorly to it. There's also a chance that he could have reacted positively to the news and sought out help that would have benefited you greatly." She heard Tony snort, yet she continued. "He also could have found help that could cause even worse damage. Maybe your mother would have left him and raised you on her own. Maybe they would have both abandoned you and another family would raise you. There are so many what-if scenarios we could come up with. Yet ultimately none of that matters, because we do not know, and unless you invent a time machine to go back and tell him, we will never know. Here's what we do know. You're autistic, you've had multiple rough patches in your life, in large part due to you not knowing, and now that you do know, you're working towards making your life better." Tony started typing on the tablet again, Ms. Owens noticing how he would sometimes pause and delete what he wrote. After a minute of typing, he pressed the speaker button and it said, "It still feels unfair. I know I'm supposed to learn and grow from my childhood, and sure, not everything was bad. Jarvis was always there for me and my mom tried her best, but it still feels unfair." "It is unfair, Tony," Ms. Owens stated. "It can be unfair, and you can have great moments. You can have quote-unquote daddy issues, yet you still have an amazing father figure. Multiple things can be true at once. You can learn about what made your childhood difficult, what you can do to prevent it from happening to possible future children. You can grow beyond this time and no longer feel burdened by it. And yet it can still be an unfair childhood." Tony set the tablet aside and rubbed his eyes, taking in all the information. He hugged at the pillow again, picking at the seams. "How do I grow?" Tony asked, a grumble in his voice making it seem like he hasn't talked in years. "How do I move on?" Well, you can't really move on from trauma. Trauma changes you. It becomes a part of you. You can't move on from something that has greatly affected you. That's why I've been saying that you can and will grow beyond your trauma. An apple will always grow from a seed, and the seeds will forever be part of the apple, but there's so much more to the apple than its seeds. Does that make sense? She asked. Tony pondered the statement for a second. My trauma are the seeds and I am an apple. He chuckled at the thought. The seeds are still in the apple, but an apple can grow away from the seeds, making it more apple than seed. So, while my trauma is still in me, I can grow beyond it to a point where I'm more than just my trauma. Ms. Owens smiled. You got it. Tony smiled back. Growing beyond childhood trauma is tough for anyone, and your autism might make things like processing said trauma even more difficult. But you've recognised your struggles, you sought out professional help, and you have a strong support system behind you. Ms. Owens nodded. I think you'll be okay. Tony's smile grew wider as he set the pillow beside him. You know, I originally came in here thinking we'd be talking about the meltdowns. Didn't realise it would turn into talking about childhood trauma. Ms. Owens shrugged. That's therapy for you. The two of them chuckled, then she said, We can certainly talk about them more in depth next week, although we have run out of time for today. No, it's okay. Tony stood up. I needed to hear those things. He walked over to the door, stopping just before leaving and saying, Thank you, Miss Owens. Of course. Have a great rest of your day, Tony. Ms. Owens smiled at him. He smiled back. You too. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. If you have, please consider subscribing. Have a lovely day.